All right, let's go ahead and jump into this week's coursework. We're going to be talking about web development using PHP specifically. And so the first half of this semester is going to be sort of really dedicated to getting a sort of foundational knowledge in PHP, something that you can hopefully then sort of translate and implement in the WordPress half of the semester, which will be the back half of the semester. I may reference WordPress things along the way to sort of just show you how PHP fits into WordPress. But we're largely just going to be sticking with sort of vanilla PHP at the beginning of the semester. And then as we move over to WordPress, we'll sort of implement PHP in themes. We'll do it in plugins. We'll explore editing themes or creating a theme, and how we can sort of extend and create websites using WordPress. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we have for this week. First, we're going to cover the sort of architecture of a web application, just to make sure everybody's on the same page as far as sort of what expectations there are for web applications, what that really means when we're talking about website development, and sort of how that relates to WordPress and PHP as well. After that, we're going to talk about how to edit and test a PHP application. So we'll do a little demonstration on how to load up MAMP or whatever sort of local hosting service that you like. So I'm going to show you how to use MAMP. There's a couple other that I can recommend as well if you don't like MAMP. So we'll go ahead and launch MAMP, create a new document, and start sort of testing out some of these basic PHP skills and get you guys and gals comfortable with sort of manipulating PHP code, understanding how it works, how it's processed on the server, and then how we can actually display it on a web page. So let's go ahead and dive in. First, of course, we're going to talk about the architecture of a web application. So the architecture of web apps it's easier to sort of display, right? And so here we have our internet, which is sort of the central place that all of our website applications connect to. And what happens is a client will go to your website address or whatever it is. They'll access that domain, and then that domain sends a request to a web server. And this is where all of our PHP files are going to live. So if you have a WordPress application running on your web server, all of the files are stored on the server for that WordPress install. And then those PHP files communicate with a database server. In this case, we'll be looking and using MySQL. And so the web server sort of talks and communicates with our database server. Both of those are oftentimes located on the same server as well. They can be separate, however. So keep that in mind. But generally speaking, your database server and your hosting server are going to be on the same. And the same goes for email server. You'll often find hosting plans that provide sort of basic email functionality. I personally recommend leaving your email server with someone who's more capable and specializes in email, because it's so important now to our day-to-day lives. Google, Office 365, all of these platforms have sort of gotten it down to a T. They have a ton of great mobile apps that you can use to sort of connect to your email. And so allowing them to just host your email is oftentimes your best bet. If for some reason you can't afford to maybe pay the extra 12 or 15 bucks a month, however much it is, for email hosting, you can oftentimes do that on your web server as well. But in this case, just know that all of these can be sort of abstracted into their own servers if they need to be, but they don't have to be by any means as well. So when we talk about the architecture of a web application, the big thing is all of our PHP files are going to be stored on the web server, and those are accessed through domains and thus the IP address as well. So when a client visits your website, lcsc.edu, that domain points to an IP address, which points to a server. And that's where the sort of HTTP request comes in. It requests the files from the server, and then it responds back to our client. And we'll talk about that here in a second as well. And so when we talk about the architecture of an internet, we have a lot of computers connected to what are called LANs. And so hopefully maybe this is a review for you, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page. So we have a bunch of computers that are connected to a LAN. For example, if you came to LCSC, all the computers in the computer lab are connected to the LCSC network. From there, they go to a WAN, and these WANs sort of communicate to each other through IXPs. And all of these sort of communicate with servers as well to return responses back through the funnel that they sort of came through. So I mentioned sort of HTTP requests earlier, and this is the sort of process that happens when someone is trying to access your website. So they're using a web browser, probably Chrome, maybe Firefox, Internet Explorer, whatever it is. They go to their browser, they type in the URL, and that establishes an HTTP request. And so this is the process of requesting the files for that homepage from the web server. So again, all of our HTML files, all of our PHP files, images, these can all be hosted on our server. And then that response is then sent back to the web browser. And that is known as an HTTP response. So here's sort of an example of what that looks like from a sort of code perspective. An HTTP request is often a GET command. And so using HTTP GET and HTTP version 1.1, it's requesting the host from the domain example.com, and then the server then pops up this response and says, okay, 200, you've successfully connected to the server. It then tells us the content type, so in this case, static HTML page, the length of that document, and the server that the document's running on. And so in this case, it's an Apache server with a version of 2.2.3. But this is the sort of basic architecture of a request and then the response to that request. You'll hear about things with HTTP, so the version's changing, and so now there's this fancy new version that's very different, and that is what this version means here. So if you wanted to use a different version of HTTP, you can do that. You just have to make sure that your server supports it, and then also the browser supports it. I won't dive too much into that. Don't worry too much. Most sites right now are still using this sort of 1.x or 1.1 version, so you don't have to worry about it too much. And so this is ultimately what we get back from the server, right? We requested example.com. This is the HTML from that page that then gets returned to the user's browser and then processed by that browser and displayed on the page. So when we're talking about dynamic websites that use PHP, so static HTML files, they sort of live on the server and they get sent back and sort of plopped on the computer. With PHP files, it sort of goes one step further. A request is sent to the server. It then checks to see if there's PHP files. It runs these PHP files, and then it returns that response to the computer. Oftentimes, these PHP files are going to have database requests, and so that starts the communication between the web server and the database server. And then whatever that end result is, it gets sort of it gets shot out back to the user in their web browser. So you'll often see this when you log into Facebook. You send your username and password. It then gets processed by the database. It does their fancy security checks and then returns, okay, this is actually you, or no, this isn't you. Do you need to change your password? Did you forget your password? So that's sort of the process, right? When we add PHP scripts, and this isn't just PHP scripts, this is any sort of programming language script, is stored on the server, processed on the server, and then sent back to the web browser. So when we talk about web application languages and databases, we're not just talking about PHP and MySQL. There are definitely other options out there, but for this course, we're just strictly talking about PHP and MySQL because that's what WordPress runs on, and that's sort of the ecosystem that's very popular right now. A large percentage of the internet is using WordPress. It's over 25% of all websites on the internet are actually powered by WordPress, and so it's sort of a huge market share that we want to address and give you guys the sort of firsthand experience. But do know there are other server-side languages as well, many that you'll probably learn in some of the other classes here in the program. But this class specifically, we're going to be looking at PHP and MySQL. So ASP.NET, Perl, Python, those are all different server-side languages other than PHP. And by and large, none of these languages are going to work with WordPress. And so if you are interested in WordPress, if you're interested in sort of diving into the world of WordPress, learning PHP, and getting used to MySQL databases is going to be your best bet. I also included some others, so Oracle, DB2, MS SQL, MariaDB, and MongoDB are actually some very popular new sort of trendy open source databases that are sort of catching some, sort of building some momentum and growing their communities. And so if you're interested in sort of newer options, those are a couple good ones for you as well. So I did want to cover the sort of PHP supported versions over the years and sort of show where PHP is at right now. So if you get into WordPress development and you start looking at hosting plans for WordPress sites, you'll often want to check the PHP version that they're supporting at the time. Many hosts are the reason that PHP takes so long to update because they don't want to update their PHP versions because they're afraid that they could break the WordPress website or the web application, whatever is running. So it's important to know when your version is still receiving sort of security updates, because anything that's not receiving security updates could potentially be hacked or become malicious. And so this is the current supported versions that you can get from php.net. 5.3 is obviously going to be the oldest version. It's not currently supported, so it's at the end of its life. So if you see a website server running 5.3, definitely try and upgrade it to 5.6 at the very least, or preferably 7.0, which has a 7.1 or 7.0, which has significantly better performance improvements as well. So if you can, make sure if you have an existing host and they're running an old version of PHP, ask them what their plans are for upgrading their PHP versions for their supported versions. If they say that we have no plans, then it's probably likely that you need to sort of look at changing hosts, because you don't want to be on a host that's running super old versions of PHP. Or you need to upgrade your hosting plan. Oftentimes, like GoDaddy, for example, they have some cheap old hosting plans that they don't upgrade the PHP version, but their business model is, okay, you're on this old plan, let's switch you over to a more modern plan, which they now offer, which have the more recent versions of PHP. So that's their way of sort of getting you out of those old cheap plans and into something that's maybe a little bit more expensive. But by and large, it's going to be a few bucks here or there. It's not going to be a huge amount of money. So moving on, 5.6 is currently only receiving security fixes as of today, the 29th of August. And so if it's running 5.6, you know, that's okay. It's not the end of the world. At least you're still getting those security fixes, and those are through January 1st, 2019. So after that point, you definitely need to sort of plan and look at upgrading to PHP 7.1, which has a sort of expected end of life near January 2020, and that's going to be your sort of best bet. So these green ones receive active support, so if there's any bugs or issues, they're sort of actively updating those and working on those. And so that's sort of the ecosystem that is PHP and supported versions. So you have to sort of check this periodically, make sure that you're running WordPress on a very up-to-date version and that you're not letting your sites get sort of outdated on the PHP front. Generally speaking, when WordPress gets updated, it's sort of built in a way that it's going to be backwards compatible, and it's going to allow you to upgrade to the most recent version of WordPress without many issues. The nice thing about WordPress, and we'll cover this more later in depth, but WordPress is open source, which means that there's a ton of community developers that are constantly developing the platform. And so if there is something that's sort of breaking your website, it's often going to be fixed by someone else out in the community. And then you can sort of update and add that fix to your own sort of local build of WordPress. And then you don't have to worry about it anymore. So next, we're going to look at editing and testing a PHP application. And so the best way to do this is actually to just demonstrate it. And so these are the topics I'm going to cover today in the demonstration. And I encourage you to follow along if you can. But the assignment will largely be this as well. And so make sure that you're sort of following along at the very least in the video, and then you can sort of do all this locally on your own computer and start sort of getting acquainted with PHP. So let's start with creating a PHP document. So I'm going to close out of my slides here, and I'm going to open up, I'm using Atom, which is a text editor. You're welcome to use Sublime Text or Visual Code Studio, whatever you prefer. It's really up to you. It's totally preference-based. I'm going to use Atom. A lot of the features that you'll see me using are going to be sort of unilaterally the same across different editors. The most important part are the actions we're taking. So first, we're going to create a new file, and we're going to sort of create an HTML document in here. So I'm I'm going to go ahead and open up the link in Blackboard. If you go into the course content and go to Hello World, this is going to be the sort of exercise that I want you to go through. And so I'm going to copy the code from here, which is just a basic HTML page, super basic, with the sort of doc type. We have our body, we have our head tags, and we have our closing HTML tags. So let's go ahead and save this now. You'll notice up here it's an untitled document, and so to save it, I just am going to click Control S or Control Shift S to save as. And for now, I'm just going to put this on my desktop, and I'm going to call it my first PHP document.php. It's really important that you have the .php at the end of your document file name. If you don't have this, it's not going to work. So make sure you have PHP at the end. Usually, you should be accustomed with something like .html or .css, but in this case, we're going to do .php. So now it sort of magically adds some formatting for us because it recognizes that this is a PHP file, some sort of syntax highlighting. Let me zoom in here so you can see this a bit better, which is very nice. And if we go ahead and open this file, so let me pull up my desktop here. And we pull it into a web browser, it's going to render fine, and that's because we don't actually have anything in our PHP block right now. So you can see the PHP there, and it's showing this tag because we're not running it through a web server yet. So just like standard HTML, we can do things like make this a heading tag, hello world. We can add an H2, this is my first document. Then we can add a paragraph tag with some lorem ipsum. We hit save, Control S. I'm going to go back to my web browser here in Chrome, hit refresh, and you can see we get the standard sort of HTML documents that you know and love at this point, right? So you have your title, you have your secondary header, you have your text. The biggest difference here is that we have to be able to run this on a web server to run that PHP. So to do that, let's go ahead and boot up MAMP. And so if you don't have MAMP installed, I encourage you to do that. And if you just go to, I would just Google MAMP, and it's going to be the first result here. You can click on downloads. It'll take you right to the downloads page. You click download here. It's going to download the pro and the free version. You don't have to worry about that too much. It's still going to run fine as long as you just run the free version. So once you have MAMP running, it's going to look something like this installed. And then all you have to do is click Start Servers. And that's going to boot up the Apache server, which runs our PHP files, and our MySQL server, which runs our database. So if I click on Open Start Page, this is the sort of MAMP landing page, which gives me all my information that we'll need later when we're creating WordPress sites, like our username and password to connect to the database is all located right here. It even gives us a straight vanilla PHP example of how we might connect to our database with PHP. You'll also notice up here the domain is localhost/MAMP. And so this might be different for you. It might look like something like this, or maybe 8080, or whatever your port number is. It sort of depends on your own configuration. And you can actually change your port number as well. But in this case, mine just says localhost.mamp. The important thing here is that you don't have like localhost.com or something like that, right? Because localhost is the local web server on the computer. And so this is the MAMP landing page. If you ever need to find this again, there's this button right here that says Open Start Page, and you can sort of find this again. You'll find out that you'll use this page more often than you think, especially for things like PHP where we can actually go in and see the databases that we're creating. And so hopefully, if you've taken the database class with Jesse already, or Casey, whoever taught it that semester, you can sort of recognize the PHP dashboard, hopefully. We can do things like create new databases and all that sort of fun stuff. But for now, we're just sticking with vanilla PHP, right? So the next step is to move our files from our desktop, because the desktop isn't inside the web server, onto the sort of directory from our local web server. And so oftentimes this is located, I actually have it pinned here to my sidebar. It's located in your C drive in the folder called MAMP, and then in a folder called htdocs. But if this path isn't working for you, go ahead and hit Preferences, and then go to Web Server. It's going to have an option to switch to Nginx. We're going to stick with Apache. And this is where your document root lives, and this should say where exactly your files live on your computer. So you can change this if you wanted it to live in a different folder, or in my case, I can just click open, and that's going to open the folder for me. So I'm going to create a new folder on the server called CITPT 175. And you'll know you're on the server because if you go up a folder into MAMP, so here's my local disk C, I have MAMP, I go into htdocs. This is essentially what we see when we go to this page. So this is our index. You'll see this oftentimes when you start a web host and you don't have any content on your website, but maybe you add a folder and you have HTML files inside those folders. You'll get sort of a list and index of those items. If I were to create a new, well, let's just put this file in there. So I'm going to go to my desktop. I'm going to copy this into this folder, and then just very quickly to show you what would happen if you had an index file in this folder. So let's change this to index.html. It's sort of telling me I'm changing the file extension, which might make the file unusable, but in our case, I know it won't. Now if I go back and refresh, we get our page without the file extension, and that's because it's living in that root folder, right? So if you're seeing something like this and you don't have access to that folder list, you can go ahead and just delete this index file, or the other option is to grab your folder name and just manually type in the directory location. And then we're going to have the same listing, and we see our first PHP document here. We can click on that, and at first glance, it's going to look exactly the same as the other ones, right? We can sort of compare these. If we click View Page Source, though, you'll notice those PHP tags have disappeared. And so everything in PHP is processed on the server, right? We send the request from the browser, so in this case, Chrome, right, which is what I'm dealing with in this window. We send the request from the browser, this little address bar, to our local server, which is MAMP in this case. We'll talk about working with remote servers later, but local server in this case is MAMP. And then the request is processed, that PHP is processed, and then it's returned back to our browser. And in this case, PHP is totally removed because we don't have any sort of PHP in our document. So one of the most important things about PHP is that you start with this tag. You always start open PHP with this tag. So it's the @ $PHP. So always when you're creating new PHP tags, let's just ignore that. You are always creating this initial tag. You notice when I have two of them, it loses the syntax highlighting because that's not properly formatted. So if I created a new PHP tag, again, it's PHP like this. I think a package is broken. Don't worry too much. You shouldn't see that. It's just an issue on my end on Atom. So we'll continue on. So here we have our first PHP sort of container, and inside that we can do something like echo hello world. And so echo is it's sort of the most basic way to sort of print text on an HTML page. So we'll hit save. Let's go back to our web document here. We're going to hit refresh, and nothing's going to happen, right? And the reason for that is this folder that we moved, this file, excuse me, that we moved is no longer on our desktop, and I'm editing the file on our desktop. So let's go ahead and copy this. I'm going to close all of this, and I'm going to go back to my htdocs folder. I'm going to go into CIPTPT 175, and I'm going to drag this file into my editor. You notice our PHP tag got reverted, and now we can paste that in, hit save, and refresh. And now we see hello world. So if we were to inspect that now, or let's do view page source, you can see here, hello world doesn't have anything wrapped around it. There's no PHP tags, and that's because when PHP runs, it processes it, returns it to the browser as it should. And in this case, with echo, it's strictly just a string that it's sort of returning back to the browser. A string meaning just words returned back. We'll talk more about sort of what string means and numbers and all of that in PHP. But if you're familiar with other languages, it's probably not too different from those. So with these echo tags, we can do things like add HTML in here as well. So if we wanted this to be an H1 tag, and we want to remove this other h1 tag so they're not conflicting, and we also want to move these below this text. We can get sort of the same effect that we had before. We hit save, and we go back to our document and hit refresh, and nothing seems to change, right? And that's because this is being echoed, and if I were to add another word here, it updates here. And so that's sort of the basic premise of Hello World, which is what I want you to do first. Go ahead and try creating a variable, which is what this process is, and sort of play around with that. Variables are always declared with a $sign. And so if you want to create a $user, this is how you, sorry for all these pop-ups. So this is how you create sort of a variable. You start with the $sign, follow it by whatever this could be, whatever you want to call it. So in this case, we call it username. We could call it color. We could call it status. And then what we do is we change this to status. And then we do what's called concatenation. And we can concatenate this variable inside of this string. And so with the current status being fantastic, we can then hit save, hit refresh on our document, and that will sort of concatenate into our other string. You'll notice I'm missing spaces, and that's because when you concatenate something, you have to add the spaces into the actual string itself, so that it will be affected on your document. So go ahead and start playing around with that. Let me check my notes really quick to make sure I'm not forgetting anything. Exploring the directories on a local server. So again, when you're going to htdocs and you're starting to play around with these things, make sure you're working in this htdocs folder, and this is the sort of directory for all of your content. And so you see I have other websites in here that I've been working on. I even have some WordPress sites in here. And just quickly to show you WordPress, like this is the core WordPress files, and you'll notice there's a bunch of PHP files, and we'll dive into what all of these mean, right? We can create themes, we can add sort of custom HTML, JavaScript, whatever you need inside of themes, you can sort of add, and WordPress offers a really flexible and customizable way to do that. So when you're deploying something to your local server, just make sure it's in the right folder. Again, I encourage you to create a folder for this class. Inside that, maybe have a week 1 folder, a week 2 folder, and then inside of that, you can put all of your individual assignments. And so that way, everything's structured very clearly. And then when we start to sort of continue on during the semester, you have things very organized. And then again, just make sure when you're viewing your document locally that you're on the localhost URL. If you forgot how to get to this, or maybe you close your tab and you can't remember, and you don't remember what your URL is off the top of your head, just go back to MAMP and click on Open Start Page. This is going to take you to the sort of MAMP homepage, and all you have to do from here is remove this folder of MAMP, and that's going to take you right back to your sort of root directory. And in this case, I want to do one last thing, which is remove this index file, and that's going to return my folder directory listing, which can be a very helpful sort of tool to have. So now you can see all your folders. As you maybe start working on WordPress on your own, you can sort of create a new folder for it. And so my workflow is to sort of establish, like if I have a client like North Idaho Attorney where I'm doing their website, I create a new folder for them, and I put all of their WordPress website information inside of that folder. So in this class, I'd sort of recommend that as well, and do it on a weekly basis as well, just so everything's nice and organized. So let me know if you have any questions. I encourage you to reach out on Slack, which is going to be sort of super effective for being able to communicate. Maybe if you have issues with MAMP getting it up and running, I can help you sort of troubleshoot that, and we can sort of go from there. So I wish you all the best of luck on these first days of PHP, and let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you guys have a great week.